A lot of our thinking is molded by this multitude of invisible forces. As a researcher of bias, what is your toolkit on counteracting it? Dr. Alexander Swan is an associate professor of psychology at Eureka College and an expert on cognitive biases. Dr. Swan, what is a bias and why do we have them in the first place? What's the evolutionary function of biases?
That's a really complex question. So I'll take the first part because that's the easiest one, right? What is a bias? It's a judgment, a systematic thinking failure. It could be a desire for or a proclivity towards something or away from something. It could be, it's really a judgment that we make in favor of or against something. Like, I like this or I don't like this. I want this, I don't want this. This is positive. No, this is negative. Okay, so that would be a bias in general. In cognitive science, a bias really has a specific definition of a systematic thinking issue. And I did say failure a couple of seconds ago, but I honestly, sometimes when you look at it evolutionarily, is it really a failure? I mean, a lot of biases are heuristics, and heuristics are just a quick way, a fast way, a more efficient way of thinking. And is it going to get us the right answer, the correct solution every single time? Probably not, but it gets us there most of the time. And I think that's fine. But when we look at biases in the literature, in cognitive science, they present a way for us to measure something that's different from the norm solution or the norm answer. And when a person does this constantly, consistently, we can call that systematic. So that's why biases are a systematic thinking error, we'll say.
So that'd be something like a bug in the software as opposed to just a one-off mistake.
Yeah, maybe a bug in the software. Maybe it's a more of a feature and not a bug, as the parlance goes today, right? This, with the to excuse my parlance, but the enshittification of the internet, right? Or just products in general. This is a feature, not a bug. So it's entirely possible it's a feature and not a bug, but to answer the second part of your question, why do they exist? What's the evolutionary reason for them? Well, there are three kinds of evolutionary products, we'll say, outcomes. One is an adaptation. Biases are not an adaptation. Heuristics may be an adaptation, depending on whether they solve an adaptive problem, right? They make our species more fit for reproduction, more fit for our environment. There are then byproducts, which are not necessarily adaptation, solving an adaptive problem, but they just kind of appear because of an adaptation. And then the third outcome is noise. They're random changes. They don't solve an adaptive problem. They're not directly linked to an adaptive problem like a byproduct is. And so I want to say that of these three outcomes, biases probably, on the whole, fit in the byproduct category. So an adaptive problem was solved by, humans started eating more fatty foods, right? That fat had to go somewhere. A good place for it to go was our brains, right? To give our brains a lot more tissue to use, which ended up becoming the myelin sheaths of what is called white matter, right? And so that solved an adaptive problem of, planning or figuring out how to work as a group or working together to solve a problem, right? Our earliest ancestors. And maybe not even Homo sapiens, but a shared ancestor earlier than that, right? Started doing this, figured out fire. Fire allows us to cook food. Food allows us to get more fats in that we couldn't necessarily digest previously with the proteins, the animals that we were eating, or the fats that we were finding in food, foraging. And so we ended up coming up with better ways to solve problems. Some of those ways to solve problems were based on limited amounts of observations. Those observations led to shortcuts in thinking. Those shortcuts ended up becoming the biases that we see today.
Yeah, it makes sense because I wouldn't particularly imagine a Kung tribesman sitting around doing syllogisms or calculating computations or something along those lines. He just has to make rather simple decisions. And presumably, if he makes them faster, well, he does better as long as he's sufficiently accurate.
Sure. Yeah. And, sometimes you're going to get it wrong. Like I said a little while ago, sometimes you're going to get it wrong. And maybe those people weren't ancestors, weren't people that we would consider ancestors, right? Because ancestors are the only ones that were able to reproduce. Everyone else weren't able to. Their genes are no longer with us, right? And so, that quick thinking error in some cases, as we've defined them today, led to their downfall.
Right, because the thing about a shortcut is the shortcut is fast. It's quick and dirty, but presumably it works most of the time because, as I said, they weren't doing the things that we're doing today with our minds. Our lives are completely different.
And we've made thinking a very complex undertaking, and the human brain consumes about 20-ish% of our daily resources, sugar, blood, oxygen, all of that stuff, right? On a daily basis when we're awake, right? And it's about 8 pounds. And so a very small percentage of our overall body weight, and requires so much of our resources now for things like, I got to do my taxes.
Or worse yet, reading a philosophy textbook.
Yeah, right. Things that we have created arbitrarily out of thin air require so much of our daily consumption that we are far removed from our ancestors' thinking days and what they were thinking about. And then, trying to translate this into other things. And don't get me wrong, human advancement is absolutely amazing and wild. But those biases still remain.
Speaking of biases, I like thinking about things in terms of power laws, the most outsized impact things. So what would you say are the most pervasive cognitive biases that distort people's reasoning on a regular basis?
Oh, this is a great question, because what I usually tell my students is confirmation bias is perhaps the most pervasive. And I'll tell you very interestingly, that the list of banned words given by the current U.S. Administration includes confirmation bias. So that has to tell you something about the power of this bias and what it does to people, right? So confirmation bias, very briefly, is the propensity to accept information as good, as valid, as important when it aligns with our current worldview, our values, our beliefs, etc. And then the other side of confirmation bias is to reject information that does not align with our current worldview. So when you talk, and confirmation bias has a role to play in memory formation, memory retrieval, information evaluation on new information. It's just so pervasive. It goes into all of our thinking systems, and it really directs us on what to think and how to think with this new information. And today's world is so rife with information that can affect a person's worldview, make it more extreme because of its persuasiveness, its power, its message, its getting at the heart of somebody's emotional thinking. All of this confirmation bias really solidifies a person's worldview into something that maybe that person no longer recognizes basic fact, really clean information that's hopefully free of any bias, but like it really prevents somebody from engaging with new information appropriately, we'll say.
I can think of more than a few particularly inflammatory political examples, which I will save for another time. But sure. I heard Julia Galef put this pretty well, where she said, I believe it was her, something along the lines of, when you encounter information that agrees with your viewpoint, you ask yourself, can I believe this? But when you encounter disconfirming information that is displeasing to you, you ask yourself, must I believe this? Do I really have to?
And this relies on a fact that I liken to the physical laws, like of physics, right? So we've got Newton's laws of thermodynamics, right? And I think it's the third law. I might be wrong about this, but like inertia, right? An object stays in motion unless it's acted on by another object, right? You have psychological inertia. And it's going to keep going in the way that makes you feel the best, right? That has you at some kind of homeostasis, some equilibrium, and you're going to keep going with that. You're going to keep doing it until something acts against it. And I think applying that idea, that psychological inertia, with what you just said about, I do believe this versus I must I believe this is absolutely psychological inertia. Confirmation bias is feeding that psychological inertia to that worldview, right? And then this disconfirming information comes along, and you think to yourself, well, I'm going this way and this thing's coming at me perpendicular. Do I really want to change? Do I really want to move?
Yeah. I've recently been developing a life model. Essentially, I've been trying to take scientific literature and design an optimal life. And I remember there was one, I forget what the specific was, but there was a piece of information that disconfirmed one of my ideas. And I remember encountering it, and it was backed by empirical evidence. So it was true. I didn't make my model according to this particular idea because I just didn't know it. And I remember feeling this feeling of displeasure, of discomfort, a little bit of like, I don't really like this idea. And then I caught it. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, there it is. There's the must I believe this. But it was empirical evidence. So I realized at that point, yeah, this is true. I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I would say, like, as empirical evidence goes, facts change, right? I want to be clear and say that, facts are only facts because there's a consensus around the information, right? Facts are not some kind of unheralded truth or something like that. So, definitely take empirical findings with a grain of salt when you come around them. Theories are good to to follow because they probably have a lot more scientific backing, a lot more data to support them. So you don't also want to fall into the trap of it's science, because that's also a bias, right? That we look at science and we go, oh, okay, that's a scientific finding. I'm going to go ahead and start believing that now. You know, the subreddit r science, people post random scientific articles all the time, and these are usually from popular press scientific findings as opposed to journal articles, right? Because journal articles are usually going to be paywalled. So to get the most impact, you want to find stuff from like Science Mag or Scientific American or something like that and share it with them. But a lot of the times these findings are correlational, and the headline doesn't really make it seem like it's correlational. And all too often, you know, you get this science versus religion. You may get caught in this debate of science versus religion, and you end up pitting the findings of science versus whatever the religion is suggesting is the nature of the world. And it's like, no. These two things are asking completely separate questions. But the religious folk will say, oh, you scientists are just as dogmatic as you say we are. And that's true, because confirmation bias, with a few other biases here, feed into scientists going, well, science says this, so I'm going to believe this. But honestly, what I want to say about that as a science communicator is that just because a scientist is saying it, okay, doesn't necessarily make it true. If they present their evidence, this is great, because all facts require evidence and support. And if what they're saying makes sense, then yeah, then you can adopt it. But you could also fall into the path of, oh, this is scientific. These are scientific findings. I'm going to follow them no matter what. And I want to make it clear that that's not always the best idea. I'll follow what scientists have been saying about red wine for, I don't know, 3 decades, 4 decades now. It's pretty hilarious how you should drink. You can drink red wine, it'll be fine. No, you shouldn't drink red wine because it's alcohol. Oh, drink wine in moderation. The contents in the wine are going to be great. No, don't drink it because it's bad for you. You know, back and forth. It's like, how about I just drink what I want to drink and let me live my life, right? Like, who cares if it's good for you or not?
I'd push back on what you said about dogma, science versus religion and dogma. There is obviously a bit of dogma in all reasoning, just because of the nature of confirmation bias pervasively affecting everything. But I would say that I believe the definition of dogma does include the unquestionability of ideas. And I'd say that's where science and religion differ more, is that everything in science is under question. The only reason that there are any sort of established truths is because those are very well validated by loads of evidence.
Yeah, I'm not. I was speaking as a religious person saying that a scientist is as dogmatic. I don't necessarily believe that. I do agree with you to some extent. There is, just like with anything, though, as somebody who researches biases, there is a human element here that of some leaning towards it. I speak as a scientist who fully adapts to how science changes 100%. But that thinking is the same as somebody who, you know, believes in a creator and the nature of the world being of that creation and fully a part of that creation. It's the same thinking is what I'm saying, right? The thinking is not as complex. It's just in a different form.
Right. The bias is built into the cognitive software.
Exactly.
How do you get over that confirmation bias, or decrease it at least?
Well, I think you had an excellent observation just a little while ago, where you said to yourself when you were reading some, conclusion, that you kind of stopped and reflected on that. And honestly, as you said in your email to me, that you watched the course that I had on the great courses, on comfort, course. on bias. Thank you very much. That right. I had a section on for each lecture on mitigating, and some of them do change. But the overall message is stop and reflect. You got to slow down. These biases operate in a mostly automatic form and on a day-to-day basis.
So-called System 1.
Yeah, System 1 or Type 1 thinking, right? Where it's fast, heuristic, considered to be the more efficient kind of thinking, type of thinking. And, as you're going on a daily basis, you spend most of your time in automatic thinking mode. You're spending the vast quantities of that 20% just engaging in keeping yourself upright, doing the things that you need to do to breathe, to pump that heart, to move your arms and all of that stuff. And most of the time that thinking is not in your conscious awareness. And so to mitigate confirmation bias, you need to stop. You need to pause yourself. So I'm a frequent user of Reddit. Okay. And Reddit has a considerable, I would say, progressive slant to it. The vast majority of subreddits that touch on political topics have a fairly progressive slant to them. And so when I'm reading through news articles, for example, on the news page, right, it's an aggregator site. So it just is a way to share and people comment on stuff, right? So when I read through comments and I'm looking for, what people are saying about this article, I always think to myself, okay, I know the slant of these users. I understand what these users are probably going to say about this particular article. And so I'll keep scrolling down. And if you're familiar with Reddit, then you know that there's upvoting and there's downvoting to change like the nature of the responses, right? To what's higher, what's lower. And I have to think, okay, well, this top comment is probably what people like the most. So let me scroll down a little bit more to find where the comments are that people don't like and see what those comments are, right?
The nuances at the bottom.
The nuances at the bottom, because the internet is famously nuance free, right? And then I'll go to, famously non-liberal or progressive slanted subreddits like R Conservative, and I'll see what they're saying about a particular thing in politics of the day, right? And I'll do my best to see how those comments integrate with my thinking, right? As a way to counteract confirmation bias. But this takes a lot of energy. Like, it doesn't make me tired, but it takes a lot of mental energy to incorporate my thinking, right? Anti my worldview. And I will, have to figure out how to integrate them. It's a slow process, right? I'm not going through this very quickly. I can't go through this very quickly because if I do, then I'm just going to rest on confirmation bias.
Yeah, I'm sure at this point there are listeners thinking that's interesting how other people's minds work, but I don't remember ever having this confirmation bias thing. This thing, I don't do this.
Yeah, that's too bad. That's funny, because you do. I mean, there's no other way to say this, right? That's cute. It's a cute comment, and I recognize that, if you're not inwardly focused or studying these kinds of things, this is another heuristic that it can be a bias. It's called availability heuristic. It is what is the top of mind comes easily to our conscious awareness, right? So what I encounter the most, what is most frequent in my world, I'm going to have the easiest time thinking about. This works for things that, I on Facebook, I follow this area, this dash cam and police scanner. And the guy who runs it's just got a vendetta against anyone who does anything that whiffs of any kind of crime. And I think to myself, every time this guy or other commenters who sort of like pile on people who, make a mistake on the road, right? Because it's dash cams. So people are quick to say, oh, this driver is so awful, right? And it's just like, yeah, they made a bit of a mistake on the road. Sometimes we have lapses. You know what I mean? This one video of this one person, as long as, they didn't create an accident, maybe give them the benefit of the doubt. So every time I see people on this page saying it, I'm just like, well, you see crime or you see bad drivers often, or you think maybe more often, and you're like, oh, people in this area can't drive, or the crime is so high. It's because you participate in that sharing. You see it all the time because you're engaging with it all the time. And this is availability heuristic, and people don't really know what availability heuristic does on a daily basis. But along with confirmation bias, it kind of shapes our worldview and our thinking, and it maintains like I said earlier, psychological inertia, but it affects our decision making. And when people say like, oh, I don't have those kinds of thoughts, I think to myself, well, you do, you're just not aware of it, because your thinking comes so easily that you're just thinking about this all the time, and so it comes so naturally.
Easy availability test. Are you afraid of airplanes? Are you afraid of going to the beach because of sharks? Easy.
Yeah, because exactly, right.
People systematically overestimate shark attacks because they hear about them, and they systematically overestimate the danger of airplanes, because that's the thing is they say to somebody, text me when you land, have safe travels. Then they get into their cars, which are far more dangerous, and don't even realize it.
Yeah, those are two of my biggest examples, right? Especially showing the studies after 9/11 and the Gallup polls that were released, where Gallup specifically asked people if they were planning to fly in 2002, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 months after, I can't remember exactly. And then again in 2003. And a lot of people said, oh, no, definitely not going to fly now, right after the attacks on September 11th, 2001. And then, 2-ish years later, year and a half later, those people, or I should say maybe the percent of people who were willing to fly shot back up to normal levels, right? And this was even after the TSA was formed, and getting to your plane was a lot harder than it was back in 2001 or whatever. That is a great example of availability heuristic informing our decision making, right? And the emotion attached here would be fear. Same thing with shark attacks. There's a great clip of early Daily Show. This is when Stephen Colbert was still on the Daily Show as a correspondent. So this is like early 2000s, more than 20-year-old clip, but I still play it for my, 18-year-old students in Psych 101, Intro Psych, where they play, it's ostensibly a segment about fear tactics that are used by the news media. And the specific one was the Summer of the Shark. And that's what the name of the clip is, Summer of the Shark. And Stephen Colbert goes down to Florida and investigates shark attacks. And the guy at the aquarium is like, no, they're pretty rare. And then he says to him, there's more danger in falling coconuts. And goes and Stephen then goes to talk to an old woman who nearly got hit in the head by a falling coconut. And she says, there's a lot more danger in falling down the stairs. And then he goes and talks to another guy, and he's like, bathtubs are actually pretty dangerous. X number of people die in bathtubs every year. And it just keeps getting more and more absurd. Camel bites, being allergic to things, getting struck by lightning on golf courses, etc. And then the segment ends with Stephen in the studio wearing bubble wrap, saying he's afraid of everything. And John asks him, what should we be afraid of this summer? And Stephen says, sharks. And they have a good old laugh about it, right? And the idea is obviously lampooning scare tactics by the news media. And this was, this is at the time was CNN and Fox News, and then your local NBC, CBS affiliate, right? And their stories on this. So quite a different landscape than today, but still sort of lampooning that. But hidden within this is this availability heuristic that sort of lives under the shadows, right? In your mind, just kind of creeping up every so often, saying, you should avoid that, or this is a problem because it's too much, or let's do this rather than that because that seems more dangerous than this, right? People thinking that cancer is a number one killer and scarfing down a cheeseburger, thinking that they'll be fine because cancer's the thing that kills you, not heart disease.
And with how preventable heart disease is with lifestyle, it's an atrocity.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, people don't understand that cardiovascular disease is the number one killer for both men and women in the United States year over year over year. And as you say, most of the factors that contribute to heart disease are controllable. There are some things that aren't controllable, like family history of heart disease, but there are a lot of things that you can do, and it's incredible because what do people talk about most often? Cancer, sharks, terrorist attacks, and people think those are more common common killers, when in fact it's the third cheeseburger this week that you're eating is actually going to contribute to it.
You mentioned that availability bias was an invisible force. You said something along those lines. This ties into the what you see is all there is bias, and I think that's why the bias blind spot exists. It's because biases aren't exactly part of our everyday phenomenological experience. It's not like the bias pops up into our consciousness and you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to systematically overestimate what's going to kill me, and then I'm going to scarf down my third cheeseburger, not even going to think about it.
Unfortunately for me, that is my life. But yeah, for most people it is subconscious for sure, or unconscious.
Which also ties into why it's so much easier to see it in other people, because their behavior and their decisions and their reasoning, not entirely, but it's a lot more visible. It's a lot more conscious. You see somebody else making an error and you think to yourself, what a stupid person. I'm glad I'm not like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, probably are. To be fair, intelligence is a normal distribution. So, half the people are above average intelligence and the other half are below, sadly. And so, yeah, you bring up a good point that most people aren't thinking about this on a day-to-day basis, except for me. I see it everywhere and I constantly catch myself. Is this a bias? Is that a bias? Am I being biased right now? And then sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm being biased. Who cares? I'm just going to do it. Right. I'm just going to be this way. I am a person just like everyone else. Right. But yes, no, I am absolutely plagued by that. And that I can thank availability heuristic for that. Just like the people who think that crime is so high because they're focused on crime every day. But you're right. It is not an experience that people have on a daily basis unless they understand a little bit and do see it in other people. And so this is one of the ways to mitigate, is to be aware when you are biased. And for a lot of people, that's hard because of the bias blind spot. We don't really know about anybody else's other thought processes. Right. The majority of us have what is called theory of mind, and we can understand, we have cognitive empathy. We can understand that other people have their own thoughts. Whether or not we use that information depends on who the person is and how you're feeling in that particular moment. Right. I can understand somebody has their own thoughts. I don't like that they have their own thoughts, maybe, because I just want them to do what I want them to do, like my children, right? Sometimes like, stop thinking for yourself and just do what I asked you to do, please. But of course, they're not going to stop thinking for themselves, and they're going to do what they want to do. And that's times that by 8 billion, and you get 8 billion minds who have the same cognitive architecture, the software, as we said, the firmware, and they're just going to engage in the behavior that they think, or the thinking that they think is appropriate for any given moment. And it's going to be based on their experiences. It's going to be based on their expectations. It's going to be based on their current knowledge. All of that stuff plays a role in whether or not they recognize that right now they are making a thinking error, or right now they're making a thinking error that they've made systematically for their entire lives.
I find that a solid way to train yourself to notice bias, at least a much easier way to start, is to start noticing bias in other people, because of yourself, it's hard. But then in other people, you're like, oh, there's the availability heuristic. Oh, no, this person's confirming their beliefs, motivated reasoning, whatever it might be.
Yeah. One of the easiest ones to work with for those who are watching or listening, one of the easiest ones to play with in other people is hindsight bias, because everyone is a Monday morning quarterback. They're just constantly thinking about, oh, well, this could have been different because XYZ. No, that's just because you have all of the information now and the event already happened, and you can, quote unquote, see the future, even though you're just rehashing the past. And that's a good one to start looking for in other people. It's very difficult to catch in yourself, though.
Tell me about the misinformation effect.
Oh, the misinformation effect is one of my favorite, and it's really important right now, considering that we are in a mis and disinformation information space, right? With social media the way that it is, and really any kind of media that you consume, besides this podcast, of course, because this particular episode of this podcast,
completely objective.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's nothing to be concerned about here. So the misinformation effect was coined in the 1970s, Elizabeth Loftus, cognitive scientist, and many of her colleagues, right? So Loftus and Palmer, Loftus and et al., and all sorts of other Loftus while she was in graduate school and then afterward, did a series of studies where they changed subtle bits of the questions that were asked of participants. Participants were shown a scene like a car crash or a slideshow of a car making a right turn and then hitting a pedestrian in the crosswalk and the guy running past you. It's a great slideshow. It's a series of still images, but it tells a very good story. And you get caught up in all of these superfluous details of these stories, right? The car crash, for example, you're like, oh my God, those cars like smashed into it, or the carnage, glass breaking, all of this stuff. And all they did was change some subtle details of the questions they asked participants. Those the car crash question, for example, classic leading question that you would find a lawyer trying to do in a court of law to a witness, for example, right? They see this car crash, and then, a few minutes later, the question is merely, how fast were the cars going when they blank into each other? And the manipulation was whatever the word was in that blank. So it was contacted, hit, bumped, collided, smashed. And what they found was the estimates of speed for this car crash, the two cars were going, hit or contacted. They were going like 15 miles an hour. Bumped, they were going 25 miles an hour. Smashed, they were going 45 miles an hour. So a single word changes the way we reconstruct the memories from what we just saw. And a couple of minutes ago, right? A couple of minutes. Everyone saw the same car crash, but they had different estimates of speed based on the word that was in that blank. And this is a subtle bias where words and their meaning, which is incredibly important to how we encode information, how we put information into long-term storage. Meaning plays a significant role in how we reconstruct those memories that we stored. And when we hear words that have specific denotations, right, their definition, their dictionary definition, as well as connotations, what they mean in context, we use that connotation here rather than denotation to make our estimate of speed, and it's phenomenal. For the other one that I talked about, where the people, where this driver hit somebody in the crosswalk, that's a highly charged event, right? Somebody hits somebody in the crosswalk, a guy runs away, the driver runs away. It's technically the definition of a hit and run, right? So they hit and then they literally run. I think it's great. The question that they ask for the misinformation effect is, one group of people get asked the question, what did the car do at the stop sign? And then the other group gets the question, what did the car do at the yield sign, right? And it's a T intersection. So if there is no sign, you have to stop according to the rules of the road. T intersection, no sign, you have to stop. But then the sign dictates what you have to do. Some T intersections literally have a stop sign, maybe because people weren't stopping. And so the traffic people put a sign there, or they put a yield sign. It's good. You're good to go if there's no oncoming traffic, right? And so does that sign have anything to do with a person coming into the crosswalk at a different after the right turn was made? No, because after the right turn was made, regardless of what sign it was, they hit a pedestrian in a crosswalk and that pedestrian had right away. There's no way around that, right? And that's the event that gets focused in memory. The misinformation effect plays on what happened prior to that. Stop sign or yield sign. And in the original slideshow that participants look at, it's a yield sign. So the misinformation effect is them getting the question, what did the car do at the stop sign? And if participants say, well, that it stopped, that's true, but they're also playing directly into the hands of the researchers by saying they stopped, when they may not have stopped if it was a yield sign. So it's very subtle in the ways the misinformation effect plays. And the misinformation effect is interesting because there are subtle ways that can affect it one way or the other. It can reduce its role or heighten its role in the reconstruction of memories. How late in the process the misinformation is given, right? So does the misinformation occur right after the event or much later in time? And if it's soon after the event, well, it gets conflated. That misinformation gets conflated with the real information. So it ends up playing a heightened role. Later in the process ends up getting a lessened role because you're like, wait a minute, why is this information coming now? It's totally off base here. Gender plays a role, right? So if you're given the information by a woman, it has less of an impact. If you're given it by a man, more of an impact, and that has to do with gender authority and traditional gender roles and all of these kinds of things. So, lots of things are in motion here when we get this information. Is the information plausible, right? And we all have our own working definitions of what is plausible. Conspiracy theorists have a wide net for what is plausible. I tend to have a more narrow net, right? People who are cynical or more discerning have a smaller net on what is plausible, right? And so plausibility plays a role. It's suggestibility plays a role too, right? This is an individual difference that humans have. Some people are more suggestible than others. So if you are one to follow a hypnotist's suggestions, then you might fall for misinformation more often than somebody who's less suggestible.
Perfect that you brought up suggestibility, because earlier you mentioned something about intelligence and bias, and I wanted to ask, do intelligent people, are they less biased? Are they more biased? Equivalent in bias?
Yeah, I would say equivalent in bias, unless they are, taking active steps to mitigate biases, like I outline in my course. Intelligence doesn't necessarily mean you are more discerning, you're more rational, you're more you're better at thinking than other people. No, for me, intelligence is defined as using what we have, right? Using what we have up here, and being able to adapt that information to new situations, new events, new information. To me, that's what intelligence is the ability to adapt what we already have, what we already know, and use it properly. This does not overshadow the role of biases in thinking. You actually have to be regimented and methodical about how you approach turning off some of these more automatic, systematic thinking, regardless of where you're at, intelligence-wise. Our people with higher intelligence going to be better at this? Well, yeah, because they have a better understanding. They have a better metacognitive understanding of their own minds, where metacognition, knowing what you have in your mind and knowing how to use it, is going to be a lot easier. I don't want to call it a superpower, but honestly, a ability, because it's a skill that you can grow, an ability to recognize when a bias is present. People who are on the other half of the intelligence scale, people with less quote unquote intelligence, who lack the ability to adapt and update in their knowledge and experience to new situations, are going to struggle with this, because not only do they have to integrate what's happening to them in real time, but then they have to counteract that with metacognition. And it's harder to grow metacognition when you aren't adapting in your environment.
What about gender and age? Do older people, are they less biased, more biased, men, women?
There probably are no differences. I don't have any data off the top of my head for gender. No, people are people, and there's a continuum of bias, and I think gender fits all shapes and sizes on that one. Now, as far as age goes, that's a really interesting question, because we have a confound with age, and that is just cognitive decline. And so with cognitive decline, you end up in the situation where, is this just a deterioration of thinking and an over-reliance on heuristics, or is this wisdom in some way? So I think with age, I would suspect you see a lot more overt bias. And this could be for a number of reasons. Cognitive decline, somebody who is stuck in their own ways, right, are more open about their beliefs because they don't really care about the consequences. I'm dying soon, so whatever. Here's what I think about this, that, and the other. Whereas a younger person has a more nimble mind, nimble in the sense that calculations and computations come a lot faster, right? Solve logic puzzles a lot easier than an older person can, but less wisdom, right? Less collected, crystallized knowledge that can help a person adapt to new situations a lot easier. And so you're maybe going to rely a little bit more on some of the fast thinking too. So I wouldn't say that maybe the younger person has a lot more, we'll say, reliance on biases that are a little bit more automatic, a little bit more pervasive, more implicit biases, as opposed to the older person and explicit.
So at this point, the listeners probably they've probably had a dismal picture of their cognition painted for them. They're probably thinking about how astounding it is that a lot of our thinking is molded by this multitude of invisible forces.
Yeah.
What, as a researcher of bias, what is your toolkit on counteracting it?
Well, first is to slow down, right? Slow down all of your thinking. A lot of people get caught up in following a storm of thinking. And this is something that I have to tell myself as a person with severe anxiety, that I can get caught in loops, spirals, anxiety spirals where I can't slow down my thinking. It's one thing after the other. So the first thing to do is to slow down. And I know that's easier said than done, but that is definitely the first thing to do, is to slow down. The second thing is to reflect. And what I mean by reflect is to rehash. And what I like to do is rehash verbally. I'll say the thing out loud to myself. And even though I am in the class of folks called a monologuer, I hear myself think in the same way that I speak more often than not. This is how I read, right? So I'm a little bit of a slow reader because I have to hear the words in my head before I move on. But there are, in many ways, this could be problematic because I could jump from one thought to the other. It's a lot easier to do than saying something out loud. So when I reflect, I say something out loud. That requires me to slow down, right? So that's step number one, slow down, reflect even slower, say the thing out loud, verbalize it. So it goes out of your mouth and back into your ears. And it gets comprehended that way as opposed to being in your head only. Does this reflect something that I'm missing? Is this piece of information a favorable or unfavorable viewpoint for X, Y, and Z? Okay, so do I really hate cats, or did I just have a bad experience with a cat and I shouldn't have a visceral reaction to cats playing on the piano, to reference a very, very old meme of a cat playing on a piano, right? Do I hate this, or is it just something that I don't like and I'll move on from, right? What is this person actually saying? Can I rephrase it, paraphrase it? Can I find other sources? That's the reflect part, right? Doing all of these extra steps. And a lot of people don't like doing these extra steps. But if you want to mitigate your biases, you got to go through this process, right? So number one, slow down. Number two, reflect. It could be as easy as just saying it to yourself. It could be looking up other sources and that kind of information. And number three, like, resolve to change, right? Understand the bias blind spot. Understand the status quo bias. The bias blind spot. It's a good question. The bias blind spot, as we mentioned earlier, is the inability to see our own biases. The status quo bias is like that psychological inertia that I was talking about earlier. It's what keeps us in the same psychological state because change sucks. We don't like change. Change is scary. It's uncertain. Humans don't like uncertainty. So it keeps us in our old thinking patterns, right? So if number three is resolve to change, then you understand that you may or may not know what biases you have or you've engaged in previously, and know that the status quo bias is there to keep you thinking in the ways that bring you the most comfort, because change is scary. Change is seen as bad, but change occurs, right? Change is always occurring. You cannot avoid change, and you are going to have to adapt to new situations regardless of how you feel about it psychologically. And so resolving to change means using the information that you've gathered about biases, looking up various sources, exploring all there is. I mean, there are close to 200 named biases in cognitive science. Some of them overlap, a lot of them overlap. But we're talking about like hundreds of biases that change the way that we think, for better or for worse. Some of them are innocuous. Some of them can have detrimental effects. And so knowing which ones you can live with, like pareidolia, right? Seeing faces or shapes that are anthropomorphic, you're going to do that regardless, and you can't change yourself from doing that. And I think it's fun, right? Find as many faces in inanimate objects as you want. But then on the other side of the coin, we've got confirmation bias, which really puts us into our tribes and our groups and keeps us there and keeps us going, and is fueled by things like groupthink and group polarization, right? And then we get stuck there, and it keeps us there, and people prey upon these biases to keep us there. To do the things that they want us to do, and we could get persuaded by things like the Forer effect or Barnum effect, if you prefer, where vague statements keep us locked in to a certain way of thinking. So resolving to change, right? This resolve part is really important. So 1, slow down. 2, reflect. 3, resolve to understand more and catch yourself. And one way you can resolve, or one way you can do the reflect, is what you suggested with, seeing it in others, right? Catching the bias in others. That's a good way to reflect. And so if you catch it in others, what are you going to do with that information? Resolve to change. That's my 3-step.
I'd add a 4th step, if possible, and that would be dialogue. So talking to somebody else who knows what they're talking about, because they can hypothetically catch you in spurious reasoning or bias. And if you don't have a dialogue partner, this is one that I love to do. I do this all the time, is I talk to ChatGPT. So first I have to lay out my reasoning. And if I can't lay out my reasoning, well, that's a red flag right there. But then if I can, I tell it, give me a completely dispassionate, objective analysis of what I'm saying, point out anywhere where I may be wrong, or my logic doesn't follow, my reason doesn't follow, it misaligns with empirical evidence. Just give me a completely objective analysis. And then I'll read that, and I will attempt to tamp down any quick and dirty, no, that's not right. I'll really read it and try to objectively analyze. And of course, this is very, this is a pain. So I only do this with important things, of course. It's not like I'm having a conversation with someone. I say, hold on, I think that was the Forer effect.
Yeah, that's true. You're not going to name every single time, for sure. I like number 4 as dialogue. Of course, we are all social beings, and so we need to engage in that. I would say be careful about the dialogue. ChatGPT is a good partner because it's not alive. It doesn't have its own thoughts and feelings beside your own. And so it's a good dialogue partner for those kinds of things. A real person can be problematic if they are not on the same wavelength as you, right? So if they're not ready to engage in this kind of dialogue, then you might have an issue of your biases either being solidified, okay, strengthened. So yeah, definitely be aware of that. And even if you're seeking the seeking dialogue with an expert like we're doing right now, definitely be aware that experts, regardless of their knowledge in a specific field, are biased humans just like you, just like everyone else. And they will rely on their own thinking shortcuts to come to conclusions, etc. So, always have that in the back of your mind. I don't mind that as a step 3A, to be fair, or 3B. 3A being resolve, 3B being a dialogue, right? Because I don't think you necessarily need to have it. But yeah, I think it's a good next step if you want to truly mitigate. I will never say that you will eliminate bias. You cannot. It's impossible to eliminate these biases because they are a part of our cognitive architecture. And as a human being, you are sworn to abide by that cognitive architecture, for better or for worse, right?
It's the structure of thought. It is what it is. So building on what you said about not being able to eliminate bias, how well does learning actually decrease bias in your thinking?
That's a good question. So I said earlier that like I live in a constant state of mitigation and reflection because I've done step 3, right? Resolve to do it. And of course, the availability heuristic makes it so I'm constantly thinking about it. That doesn't mean I live in the middle, right? I have opinions. I have things that I find favorable, unfavorable, and I go with the flow. I'm allowed to be a human, right? But it does allow me to make different choices when I need to, right? So I have that snap decision. This is what I want to do. But I'll stop myself, right? And the snap decision sometimes comes with an emotional component to it. So sometimes a student will say will write something to me or say something to me that I find to be incorrect and unhelpful. Trying to be charitable here. So I will, instead of replying with my usual snark or sarcasm, I'll wait a day and I'll come back to it and I'll say something that is appropriate for both of us in this student-professor relationship, right? So I will allow myself to have those feelings, right? Feel those feelings, but not act on them, and be able to engage a little bit better after fresh eyes, fresh head, that kind of thing, right? A period of sleep. And I would say that is learning, right? That is the ability to take new information and apply it proactively, right? Which is learning, taking new information and being able to use it. So while you're never going to be perfect, because you can't eliminate them, you can learn to live with them, I'd say.
We've talked about downsides. We've talked about how biases mess with our reasoning. They mess with our decision making. Is there any upside to this biased irrationality?
Biased irrationality. Well, let me take I actually like that you brought up irrationality, and I want to give you a definition of rational that I think maybe strays from either the common conception of rationality or what you've maybe read in the literature yourself. Here's my definition of rationality, and it stems from work that my graduate advisor had done in the reasoning literature. His name is Russell Revlin. And he, in 1988 paper, I want to say, or 86 paper, I'm not entirely sure, off the top of my head, he defines rationality, and I find it to be the best definition that I've come across in my studies. And that is this: rational is coming to a sensible conclusion, reasonable conclusion that is made in support of our own goals. Okay, whatever our goals may be. Okay, so rationality is always in support of our goals. So something that may be considered irrational from somebody else's perspective is completely rational from that person's perspective, the person who's engaging in the behavior, because it's in support of their own goals. Okay. where something irrational is thinking or behavior that is opposite or not in support of our own goals, right? So when you ask the question, is there any upside to our biased irrationality? I want to take a step back and say, I wouldn't call biases irrational for the definition that I just gave. We don't have much control over them, so it's hard to say whether or not they're irrational or rational, because we don't know whether they're in support of our own goals or not. There are some overt cases of bias, maybe in the case of racial bias or other forms of implicit bias, which might not be helpful to our own goals, but we may not be fully aware of that unless somebody is like, yeah, I know this is probably going to tank my career, but I'm going to go out and say it. These people are bad. Right? That would probably be an irrational decision, but a conscious decision, not necessarily a result of a bias. So I would say biases are rational in the sense that they allow us to be more efficient thinkers, and that's definitely a goal.
Because otherwise we'd sit around computing everything. We'd just sit there thinking about every little piece of data instead of taking actions.
We would. There is an interesting computer model for what the future of what a future evolved human would look like. I urge anyone to go look to see what those are. They've been around for maybe 10 years now, and it's like this giant headed person, okay, with no neck and a very large body that is meant for a sedentary lifestyle. And these models, these computer animations are based on models of continued sedentary lifestyles, right? And how we wouldn't need a muscular body because we wouldn't be active. I think it's a fiction, of course, because I don't think humans are going to evolve like that, but be that as it may, the idea is that our heads grow because we are sitting around just engaging in cognitive exercises and these kinds of things. So of course our brains get bigger and they're going to require more energy, but that's not the goal of human evolution. Well, I speak probably out of turn here. There is no goal of evolution. Evolution has no goal. Evolution just takes existing structures and makes them different due to mutations in DNA. So solving an adaptive problem, I don't think, because they're byproducts, they're not necessarily going to get to the solving of adaptive problems. So that is a long answer to say that I don't think biases are irrational for the most part. But to answer your initial question of is there any upside to biases? Hell yeah. There is absolutely an upside to them. Some of them are egregiously bad. And you should avoid those at all costs. But then some of them are pretty good at saving us from getting caught in computational loops, algorithmic issues, as you put, a few minutes ago. The idea that if you just want to get something done, groupthink is really, really helpful, because everyone's just like, yeah, let's do it. Okay, let's do it. Yeah, let's do it. And then you go and do it. And it's great, right? Groupthink isn't going to get you in trouble every single time when decisions are heavy and consequences can be bad, then yes, groupthink is terrible, right? I already mentioned pareidolia and other perceptual biases that occur that help us navigate a really complex three-dimensional world with a two-dimensional retina. Like, I think it's incredible how our brain takes a three-dimensional world, gets flattened, and then recreates that three-dimensional world. That's freaking amazing. And even though we can't see an ultraviolet light, and we only see a sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, hey, I think it's great. We see a boundless amount of color. It's pretty cool, right? Like, flowers are amazing. I think that smell and memory, music and memory are fantastic. Biases that can release our own endogenous opioids, right? And bring pain relief. I think that's incredible. We have, in all fairness to the bias blind spot, for the vast majority of human history where people didn't really contact or have contact with others, like, it was fine to be biased. It's just that we live in a really dense world now, and we have to understand that other people have minds of their own, that we kind of have to reckon with it. But like, for, we'll say it's only really been a problem for the last 2,000-ish years or so, 3,000 years. And humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. So, I mean, the upside is, hey, we're here. For better or for worse, we're the dominant species on this planet. For better or for worse, we have developed amazing technology that has gotten us to the moon, exploring the cosmos, all of these kinds of things. Like, for better or for worse, our biases have gotten us to certain places. And so I think that's the upside. Humans are humans, and they're going to be humans.
Yeah, to my knowledge, it seems fair to say that cognition requires bias to a certain extent because of, well, the finitary predicament, the algorithmic problem. The reason there isn't any sort of purely algorithmic AI that takes in all the data and makes a perfect decision, because it just sits there computing ad infinitum.
Yeah. I mean, Douglas Adams has a great farcical look at this, right? In all of its satirical glory. The mice wanted to know what the ultimate answer to life, the universe, and everything was, and they had Earth created to answer this question. And Deep Thought comes back with, I'm still thinking, but here's 42. In that I've got 42 and don't panic right here on my wrist. Because it is such a simple answer to a problem, to a question that can't be answered, right? So you're right. We're probably not ever going to be able to get a perfect answer, because the perfect answer doesn't exist, right? The universe is chaotic and always wants to return to a level of chaos. Order is the unnatural state of the universe. And so we need biases to get us through that chaos, because our brains cannot algorithm our way through life. It's too complex. There are too many variables, and our brains cannot deal with that much information. And the simple fact is, our sensory experience, whatever objective reality looks like, our senses change it to a subjective reality. And our senses are getting so much information that our brains have to cut off anyways. They have to filter it anyways. And that's what attention is. So there's no possible way that we can get all of the information that we need to get that perfect conclusion.
Do you, in your life, do you ever use your biases, harness them for your own gain?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, no. I probably do, to be fair. But I can't think of any example from what I do. I'm more or less what we've talked about for the majority of this conversation, more or less stopping them from changing the way that I think. Interesting question. I've never framed it that way. I suppose understanding and recognizing them is a way to make more rational decisions, but I don't think I've harnessed them in any particular way by themselves, I'll say. Except for maybe pareidolia, which finding faces in everything is quite fun.
So you can have a little bit more fun looking at pretzels and outlets.
Yes, I have a picture somewhere in my camera reel of several years ago. I was biting in and eating a ice cream sandwich. And I got to the end of it and I was like, this shape looks familiar. And it turned out I had bitten it into the shape of the state of Minnesota.
I have one final question before we wrap up. Say the listener forgets everything we've talked about, just forgets the whole thing. This entire conversation is wiped. If you could give only one or a few concepts for overcoming and mitigating bias, what would they be?
I would say I would go back to my 3-step plan here. First, you want to recognize that and slow down. You want to recognize it, right? You want to reflect. So slow down, recognize, reflect, and then resolve. Resolve to change. Resolve to follow a different path. Maybe this requires and sort of articulating your goals so you can see whether or not the bias is going to lead you to the bias is rational or you mitigating that bias is rational, right? Recognize, articulate your goals, and then you can do that 3-step process.
All right. Dr. Swan, thank you for joining me. And if any listeners are interested in this conversation about biases, Dr. Swan has an excellent, great course titled Understanding Cognitive Biases on thegreatcourses.com. I'll link it below. He also has a podcast, the Cinema Psych podcast?
Yep, Cinema Psych podcast. There it is.
I will likewise link that below.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Swan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
If you like this episode, I think you'll like one of these 2 episodes here. Also, please subscribe if you enjoyed the podcast, as it is the single best way for me to get more and better guests on the show.